the Middle East crisis, and how it affects your finances. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning. You check the news and see one headline dominating every screen. Tensions between the United States and Iran are escalating. At first, it seems like just another geopolitical story happening thousands of miles away. But then something strange happens. Fuel prices begin to climb. Food becomes more expensive. Shipping slows down. Stock markets become unstable. And suddenly, without warning, the money in your pocket does not stretch as far as it used to. What if a conflict in the Middle East could quietly trigger a financial ripple that reaches every country, every household, and every wallet on the planet? Because the reality is, it can. And that is exactly why the growing tensions between the United States and Iran matter far more than most people realize. This is not just a political story. It is an economic story, a global story, and for millions of people around the world, it could soon become a personal financial story. Today, we are going to break down why the relationship between the United States and Iran has been tense for decades, why the entire global economy reacts whenever these tensions rise, how oil, trade, and markets are deeply connected to this conflict, and most importantly, how it could affect your everyday finances. But to understand where things are going, we first need to understand how this rivalry began. A rivalry decade in the making. The tensions between the United States and Iran did not start yesterday. In fact, they go back more than 70 years. For much of the early 20th century, Iran was seen as a strategic ally of the United States. The country was ruled by a monarch known as the Shah, who maintained strong ties with Western governments. But everything changed in 1979. That year, a massive political upheaval known as the Iranian Revolution transformed the country. The monarchy was overthrown, and Iran became an Islamic republic, with a leadership that strongly opposed Western influence. Soon after, relations between the two nations deteriorated dramatically. One of the most dramatic moments came during the Iran hostage crisis, when American diplomats were taken hostage inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. For 444 days, the crisis dominated international headlines and deeply damaged relations between the two countries. Since then, the relationship between the United States and Iran has been marked by decades of mistrust, sanctions, political confrontations, and occasional military tensions. But why does this rivalry matter so much today? Because Iran occupies a strategically critical position in the global energy system. And that brings us to one of the most important geographic choke points in the entire world, the most important waterway in global energy. On a map, it looks small, just a narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But this location controls one of the most important trade routes on Earth. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. Every single day, enormous oil tankers pass through this narrow channel carrying energy supplies to the rest of the world. Roughly 1/5 of the global oil supply travels through this route. To put that into perspective, if the global economy were a human body, the Strait of Hormuz would be one of its main arteries. Energy from major oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq flows through this passage every day. Any disruption to this route, even for a short time, could send shockwaves across the entire global economy. That is why whenever tensions rise between the United States and Iran, global markets start paying very close attention, because Iran sits right beside this vital energy corridor. And in the past, Iranian leaders have warned that if conflict escalates, the Strait of Hormuz could be disrupted. If that happened, oil shipments would slow dramatically. And when oil supply becomes uncertain, prices move fast, very fast. Oil prices react instantly. Oil is one of the most important commodities in the modern world. It powers transportation. It fuels industries. It supports agriculture, and it keeps global trade moving. So when geopolitical tensions threaten oil supply, markets react almost immediately. Investors and traders around the world begin to ask one question. What if the supply of oil suddenly decreases? Even the possibility of disruption can push prices upward, because markets do not just react to events, They react to risk. When traders believe that conflict could interfere with production or transportation, they begin buying oil futures contracts in anticipation of shortages. That demand alone can push prices higher, and higher oil prices quickly translate into higher living costs around the world. But oil does not just affect gasoline. It affects almost everything you buy, the hidden link between oil and everyday life. Most people think of oil mainly as fuel for cars. But the reality is far more complex. Oil sits at the center of the entire global economic system. Let us look at just a few examples. Transportation. Nearly all global transportation depends on oil. This includes trucks delivering groceries, cargo ships transporting products, airplanes flying across continents. When oil prices rise, transportation costs increase, and businesses eventually pass those costs on to consumers. Food production. Modern agriculture relies heavily on energy. Farm machinery runs on fuel. Fertilizers require energy to manufacture. Food transportation requires trucks and ships. When energy prices rise, food prices usually follow. Manufacturing. Factories around the world depend on energy to operate. Higher energy prices increase production costs. Companies often respond by raising prices on consumer goods. Global trade. Shipping companies rely on massive cargo vessels that consume huge amounts of fuel. When fuel costs increase, shipping prices rise. And that affects the cost of everything from electronics to clothing. In other words, oil does not just fuel vehicles. It fuels the entire global economy. And when oil prices surge, the impact spreads across almost every industry. The domino effect on global inflation. This is where things become even more serious. When energy prices rise significantly, economists begin to worry about something called inflation. Inflation simply means the overall rise in prices across an economy. But energy shocks can accelerate inflation very quickly. Here is how the domino effect works. First, oil prices rise. Then transportation costs increase. Then businesses raise prices. Then consumers start paying more for everyday goods. Before long, the cost of living rises across the entire economy. Central banks may respond by raising interest rates to control inflation, but higher interest rates can slow economic growth, which means the economy faces two problems at once: higher prices and slower growth. Economists call this dangerous combination stagflation. And historically, stagflation has triggered some of the most difficult economic periods in modern history. Why financial markets are nervous. Whenever geopolitical tensions increase, financial markets become more volatile. Investors begin reassessing risk. Stock markets may fluctuate. Certain industries become more vulnerable. Airlines, for example, are highly sensitive to fuel prices. If oil becomes more expensive, airline profits may decline. Manufacturers that rely heavily on energy may also face higher operating costs. But not every sector suffers. Energy companies sometimes benefit when oil prices rise, and certain assets gain popularity during periods of uncertainty. Or the most famous safe haven assets in times of crisis is gold. For centuries, investors have turned to gold when geopolitical tensions rise, because when uncertainty spreads, people look for stability. When global energy markets shake, the fragile balance of global energy. The modern world runs on energy. Every truck delivering groceries, every airplane crossing oceans, and every factory producing goods depends on a stable supply of fuel. For decades, the global economy has relied heavily on oil produced in the Middle East. And when geopolitical tensions rise in this region, markets respond almost immediately. That is why investors and governments pay extremely close attention to any conflict involving the United States and Iran. Because if the situation escalates, the impact could ripple across the entire global energy system. To understand why, we need to explore how the global oil network actually works. The global oil highway. Imagine a vast network of highways across oceans. But instead of cars, these highways carry enormous oil tankers. Every day, these ships transport millions of barrels of crude oil from producing countries to major energy consumers around the world. Much of this oil originates from the Persian Gulf. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, United Arab Emirates export massive volumes of oil to markets in Asia, Europe, North America. But before this oil can reach global markets, most of it must pass through one narrow gateway, the Strait of Hormuz. This waterway is only about 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, yet it carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply. If anything disrupts this route, whether through military tension, naval blockades, or security risks, global energy supply could be affected almost immediately. And when supply becomes uncertain, prices rise. What happens if shipping stops? Let us imagine a hypothetical scenario. Tensions between the United States and Iran escalate significantly. Military forces begin positioning themselves in the region. Shipping companies grow nervous about the safety of their vessels. Insurance companies begin raising premiums for ships traveling through the Strait of Hormuz. Some shipping firms decide the risk is too high. They temporarily halt their shipments. Even if the disruption lasts only a few days, markets could react dramatically. Oil prices might surge overnight. Energy traders would scramble to secure supply. Governments might begin tapping emergency oil reserves. And financial markets would likely become extremely volatile. But the economic ripple effects would not stop there. The shockwave, through global trade, oil is not just an energy source. It is also the backbone of global transportation. When energy prices spike, the cost of moving goods across the world increases dramatically. Container ships, cargo trucks, and aircraft all rely on fuel. Higher fuel prices mean higher transportation costs, and those costs eventually reach consumers. Consider the journey of a simple product, smartphone. Its components may be manufactured in multiple countries. They might be assembled in another region entirely. Then they are shipped across oceans to retail stores around the world. Every step of that journey depends on energy. If transportation costs rise, the final price of that product rises as well. And that is how geopolitical tensions, thousands of miles away, can quietly increase the cost of everyday goods. The Red Sea and global trade routes. Another critical trade corridor lies nearby. It is the Red Sea, which connects the Middle East to Europe through the Suez Canal. This route is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. It allows ships traveling from Asia to reach European markets without sailing all the way around Africa. If conflict spreads across the region or disrupts maritime security, shipping companies may avoid these waters entirely. That would force vessels to take much longer routes. Longer routes mean higher fuel consumption, longer delivery times, increased shipping costs, and again, those costs eventually reach consumers. In a globalized economy, supply chains are extremely interconnected. A disruption in one region can affect markets on the other side of the world. Why investors panic during geopolitical crises? Financial markets are driven by expectations. Investors constantly try to anticipate what might happen next. When geopolitical tensions rise, uncertainty increases, and uncertainty makes markets nervous. Stock prices often fluctuate more dramatically during periods of international conflict. Investors may sell assets they consider risky. At the same time, they move money into assets perceived as safer. This shift can trigger rapid market movements. Industries that rely heavily on energy, such as airlines, transportation companies, and manufacturing firms, may experience declining stock prices. Meanwhile, energy companies sometimes benefit from rising oil prices. But one asset class often becomes particularly attractive during times of global instability: gold. For centuries, investors have viewed gold as a store of value during uncertain times. When geopolitical tensions rise, demand for gold often increases, and its price may climb as investors search for financial security. Currency shifts, and the global financial system. Another less obvious effect of geopolitical crises involves currency markets. When uncertainty spreads across the world, investors often seek stability in certain currencies. One of the most prominent safe haven currencies is the US dollar. During times of global stress, investors frequently move their capital into dollar-denominated assets. This increased demand can strengthen the value of the dollar. While a stronger dollar may benefit some investors, it can create challenges for other economies. Countries that rely heavily on imports and face higher costs. A stronger dollar can also increase the burden of international debt for many developing nations. In other words, a geopolitical crisis can reshape global financial flows in ways that affect economies far removed from the original conflict. How developing economies feel the pressure. For many developing countries, rising energy prices can create serious economic challenges. Countries that import large quantities of oil may face higher national energy bills. Governments may be forced to spend more money subsidizing fuel or electricity. At the same time, inflation may begin rising across the economy. Food prices increase. Transportation costs climb. Household budgets become strained. In extreme cases, economic pressure can even lead to political instability. History has shown that sharp increases in food or fuel prices can trigger protests and social unrest in some regions. This illustrates just how deeply energy markets are connected to global stability. Businesses feel the impact. 2. Companies around the world closely monitor geopolitical developments, because even small disruptions can affect their operations. A manufacturing company may face rising production costs if energy prices increase. Retailers may see higher transportation costs for imported goods. Airlines may struggle with rising jet fuel prices. Shipping companies may need to reroute vessels to avoid conflict zones. Each of these adjustments can reduce profits or increase prices. In many cases, businesses pass these costs on to consumers, which means ordinary households eventually feel the financial impact. How the U.S.-Iran tensions could shape the global economy and your finances. So far in this documentary, we have explored how tensions between the United States and Iran can affect global oil markets, trade routes, and financial systems. But to truly understand the risks ahead, we need to look at history. Because the world has faced energy shocks before, and the lessons from those crises reveal just how powerful the ripple effects of oil disruptions can be. The inflation domino effect. When oil prices rise sharply, the impact spreads through the economy like falling dominoes. First, transportation becomes more expensive. Trucks delivering goods must pay more for fuel. Airlines must spend more on jet fuel. Shipping companies face rising operating costs. Next, businesses begin adjusting their prices. Retailers increase prices to offset higher transportation costs. Manufacturers raise prices because production becomes more expensive. Farmers face rising costs for fuel, fertilizers, and equipment. Eventually, these increases reach consumers. Food prices climb. Electricity bills rise. Transportation costs increase. And households begin feeling the pressure. This is how energy shocks translate into inflation in everyday life. Central banks and interest rates. When inflation begins rising rapidly, central banks step in. Institutions like the Federal Reserve in the United States try to control inflation by raising interest rates. Higher interest rates make borrowing more expensive. Loans for homes, cars, and businesses become costlier. The goal is to slow down spending and reduce inflation. This solution comes with a trade-off. Higher interest rates can slow economic growth. Businesses may delay investments. Consumers may reduce spending, and unemployment can rise. In other words, efforts to control inflation can sometimes trigger economic slowdowns. How financial markets react. Financial markets are extremely sensitive to geopolitical developments. When tensions rise between major powers, investors quickly reassess risk. Stock markets may become volatile. Certain industries become more vulnerable. For example, airlines and transportation companies are highly sensitive to rising fuel costs. Higher oil prices can reduce profits in these sectors. On the other hand, energy companies may benefit from rising oil prices. Investors often shift money towards sectors that are likely to perform well during energy shortages. Smart ways to protect your finances. While individuals cannot control geopolitical conflicts, they can take steps to strengthen their financial resilience. Here are several practical strategies. Build an emergency fund. One of the most important financial safety nets is an emergency fund. Financial experts typically recommend saving enough money to cover 3 to 6 months of living expenses. This reserve can help households navigate unexpected economic challenges such as job loss, rising costs, or market volatility. Diversify investments. Diversification is a fundamental principle of risk management. Instead of concentrating investments in a single asset class, spreading investments across multiple sectors can reduce risk. For example, a balanced portfolio may include stocks, bonds, commodities, international investments. This approach helps protect investors from shocks affecting specific industries or markets. Reduce high-interest debt. During periods of economic uncertainty, reducing high-interest debt can provide financial stability. Credit card debt and high-interest loans can become more difficult to manage if interest rates rise. Paying down these obligations can free up more income and reduce financial stress. Focus on long-term planning. Geopolitical events often cause short-term market fluctuations, but successful investors typically focus on long-term strategies rather than reacting to temporary market movements. Maintaining a disciplined financial plan can help individuals navigate periods of uncertainty. The future of global energy. Looking ahead, many governments and companies are working to reduce dependence on oil. Investments in renewable energy sources such as solar and wind power are growing rapidly. Electric vehicles are becoming more common. Technological innovation is transforming the global energy landscape. These changes may gradually reduce the economic vulnerability associated with oil supply disruptions. However, the transition will take time. For the foreseeable future, oil will remain a critical component of the global energy system, which means geopolitical tensions in energy-producing regions will continue to influence the global economy. Let us look at it again. The relationship between the United States and Iran is more than a diplomatic issue. It is a key factor in global energy markets. And because energy lies at the center of modern economic systems, disruptions can have far-reaching consequences. From rising fuel prices to inflation and market volatility, the effects can eventually reach households around the world. But knowledge is power. By understanding how these systems work, individuals can make smarter financial decisions and better prepare for economic uncertainty. If this video helped you understand how global events can affect your money, then here is something important. The world is becoming more interconnected every year. Geopolitics, economics, technology, and finance are all deeply linked. And the more you understand these connections, the better prepared you will be for the future. So if you want more deep dive documentaries that explain how global events shape your finances and the world economy, make sure to like this video. It helps more people discover this content. Leave a comment and tell us what global topic you want explained next. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next breakdown. Because in today's world, understanding the bigger picture is not just interesting. It might be one of the most valuable investments you can make. And the next story we explore might reveal another hidden force shaping the global economy. So stay curious, and we will see you in the next video.